Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Hi, I'm the toe jam you didn't know you needed. Like actual jam made from toes, Kendra.
And hi, I'm a sociopathic AI who's looking for love in all the wrong places. Tony.
And this is the Imaginaries podcast, in which we discuss all things imaginary, including ourselves, but only rarely ourselves, because usually the world is far more interesting. I mean, I'm speaking from personal experience. Actually, Tony, you're fascinating. Let's
thanks.
skip that. Okay.
I'm imaginary.
So today we're going to discuss a number of interesting worlds in which we would like to actually live. Worlds of science fiction or fantasy, depending on our inclinations, that we could actually see ourselves, like ourselves, not us projecting ourselves into other characters that are already on the page, but like ourselves, Tony, Kent, in these worlds.
Yes.
So we're going to talk about that a bit today.
Yep.
It's a little bit of a departure from the norm. It's going to be playful. It's going to be fun. It's going to be light.
It's
going to
great.
be good. It's going to be great.
Great.
And before we get there, before Tony reduces me to a slobbering mess. We are going to just kind of hit a couple of news points, things that are happening in the current world of science fiction or fantasy. We're going to start introducing some of those moments at the top of the podcast. And today, Tony, would you like to introduce the article that you forwarded on to me so kindly earlier today?
Absolutely. So our last podcast, if you listened to the last episode, was all about the gays in science fiction and fantasy. So it was appropriate that between the recording of that episode and this episode, an article appeared on Tor.com called "How Do We Establish Speculative Fiction's LGBTQ+ Canon" by Brian Cebulski. So give that a Google and give it a read if you haven't yet. We had mixed reactions to the article, which is fantastic because this kind of article, I think, is there to stir up debate. Like, it's not there to say, like, agree with everything that I'm saying.
Yeah, and it did some, like, name calling a little bit.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting and it's provocative. It's the sort of article that Tor and I guess IO9 have really made a habit of publishing in recent years, and we're very, very grateful for it because even if we don't agree with the specifics of an article, it does broaden the conversation.
Yes.
And when it comes to speculative fiction in that is also LGBTQ plus friendly,
Yes.
There hasn't been a whole lot of that conversation, and that's actually specifically what Cebulski is grappling with here.
Yeah.
So how do we begin to develop lists or collections based on our dual interests and identities as speculative fiction lovers and queer people?
Yeah.
So check it out, Tor.com.
Totally. And my quick response to that, and we'll keep this under a minute or two, but my response to that in general is that the title for me is its own answer. We don't establish a canon. Like, we get rid of the idea of canon. Like, in our episode last week, we were not advocating for a particular gay science fiction and fantasy canon. We were just saying, these are some of our favorites. Check them out if you haven't seen them so far. So, granted, you know, like, the point of this article is to establish a canon, but my response to that is, no canons.
Well, and it's always hilarious when an article explicitly states gatekeeping is evil and then goes on to do a little bit of gatekeeping.
Yeah.
And that's part of the issue. And I actually have a little bit more of a fatalistic idea of what might happen in the future. In that I think that people will establish an LGBTQ plus community canon in speculative fiction. I think that is inevitable.
Yeah.
And I think it's something we have to fight every step of the way. But the establishment of a canon means that it will also create a platform for reaction and rejection and other creative works in the future. So it's not the end of the world to have a canon that then you react against.
Right.
But it will make people angry.
Totally.
And alienate some people, which is not great.
And really, at the end of the day, my idea of what the canon is it's those works that people keep talking about, that they go back to and read and, get talked about in forums like what Tor.com is offering here, what we have with the podcast, how people respond to the podcast. Both our episode last week and this article do spend a bit of time talking about Joe Haldeman's The Forever War, I think we were a little, or at least I was a little more positive when it came to The Forever War than Cebulski is in this article. But, you know, the fact that The Forever War is still continually mentioned with respect to LGBTQ plus folks and science fiction and fantasy is something that isn't necessarily going away unless we stop talking about the Forever War. So really the key, I think, to whether you're talking about a canon or a list or just like works that get talked about is to talk about them. So take that for what it's worth.
And like we could literally talk about this article for an entire episode in and of itself. My personal peeve was the little call out against Kim Stanley Robinson, who I love. But yeah, I think that we'll just kind of leave it there for now. Know that this article is out there. Check it out. If you have a response, go ahead and both drop Tor a line and drop us a line. We'd love to hear your thoughts on it. And our email address, just so you remember this, is imaginarypod@gmail.com. Super hard to remember, so just need to write that down. Carve it into your heart, oh Lord, or whatever. I don't even remember. That's like the thing. Okay. Anyway, so today, the podcast, we're getting there. It's going to happen. We had a conversation on the sly, off the record, a couple weeks back, in which we were like, would I actually want to live in this world? I'm forgetting which book we were talking about. Oh, it was The Forever War. We were talking about The Forever War. And like, would we actually want to live in that gay future or not? And the answers are super messy and complicated. But we were like, oh, but what about this world? What about this other world? Like, would I want to live in these worlds? And so that was the basis for this week's podcast in which we discuss worlds in which we would actually want to live. There's going to be a brief reactionary segment at the end in which we take down some texts that we love very, very much but would not want to inhabit. And so we'll get there as well.
Totally.
So, Tony, do you want to open us up with the first world that you would actually want to inhabit?
And this one is going to be pretty predictable. It is not Star Trek, although that is my second universe that I'd like to inhabit.
Tony, you just spoiled number two.
I know. But, I mean, if you guys listen to this podcast at all, you will know that obviously I would probably talk about Star Trek. But I don't want to start off with it. Rather, I want to start off with the Harry Potter universe.
Aww.
Because here is the main principle that's guiding my love for Harry Potter as a universe I would like to be a part of. It is the limited view. I'm thinking here specifically of like the first 4 or 5 books of the series where we have not really stepped outside Harry's experiences at Hogwarts. We haven't really gone into like the wide wizarding world. We certainly haven't like, you know, gone back and established other franchises within the franchise. Because in my mind, the further we get into J.K. Rowling's Wizarding World, or whatever the hell we're calling the whole franchise now, the worse it is because it just falls apart because there's like no rhyme or reason to any of it. And I get that may be something that some folks are into, but for me, I really tend towards, and if you go back a really long way and listen to our Magical Systems podcast, you will...
That was a good episode.
It was, so check that out if you haven't checked it out. But the long and short of that is like, I prefer a little more structure with my magic, which the Harry Potter universe does not give us. However, in the first few books, Harry's viewpoint is so limited, and we pretty much see nothing except for his experiences at Hogwarts with, you know, the weirdo teachers and the bizarre hijinks they get into. So, you know, given that limited view, I would love to have been a classmate of Harry's around that time where, you know, I would have to get the obscure instruments and go to Diagon Alley and, you know, write on the Hogwarts Express. And I know that I'm not alone in this. This is millions and millions and millions of people who are older than us, younger than us, same age. But, you know, the reason why it is a world I'd like to live in is because at the end of it, Harry just isn't very observant, and the kind of things that I didn't like about the series are the kinds of things he did not notice until the series had aged a little bit. So...
Well, and I mean, puberty has that effect on real people, too.
Yes.
But I would note that both your first and second pick, Harry Potter and Star Trek, are the kind of franchise that has developed such a prolific and robust fandom.
Absolutely.
I realize they said that as 2 words, but fandom. They've both created such almost like religious fervor in their fans.
Oh, yeah.
And that means that people really do sometimes get the full immersion experience with these texts and these worlds. So there are people out there who like literally live and breathe Harry Potter, who literally live and breathe Star Trek, who are so immersed in it that it feels real. So like that's something cool that not every franchise or book is going to get to. Just, you know, like it's not possible for most texts. So that's a cool thing. And that's a commonality that I noticed between your first two.
Yes. Yeah.
So go on to your second one.
Well, all right, let me talk a little bit about Star Trek. And the common thread that is going to...
Twist my arm.
I know, right? Oh, my God, do I have to talk about Star Trek again? Oh, no. Oh, no. Yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Oh, yes. Okay, now stop sounding like you're orgasming and tell us.
So Star Trek, and my next couple of picks as well, you're going to notice that apparently I have a really utopian leaning, which on the one hand makes a lot of sense, because who really wouldn't want to live in a utopia
where like universal healthcare is a reality? Oh, I mean Canada.
Right, exactly. Who wouldn't want to live in Canada? I ask you. But you know, this is limited because, you know, if I'm contrasting these entries on my list with a work like Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed, which granted gets into anarchism as much as it is about, you know, utopian thought and structure. I guess what I'm getting at here is I like utopias when they're supported by something else, when you don't have to think about them too much. So Star Trek is a great example of what I like to call utopian post-capitalism. And the reason why I call it that, I'm going to, as I so often do when I talk about Star Trek, take a jump into Deep Space Nine, where I think we get the broadest view of what it means to be a non-Starfleet person in the Federation of all the series. And I'm thinking specifically here of Ben Sisko's family, specifically his father and his son. His father owns a restaurant in the Deep South, and I want to say New Orleans. But I feel like it's Baton Rouge now that I'm saying it. But I think it's one of those two. And has been a chef for like years and years and years, and it's what he loves to do. Like, he loves to cook for people, and he can. Like, you know, he doesn't have to worry about not being able to make it as a chef or like losing money. And same thing for Sisko's son Jake, who decides he wants to be a writer and is variously successful at it. But his success has nothing to do with like providing for himself or like taking a shitty retail or bartending job to like make up for his writing. Like both of you know, Sisko the elder and Sisko the younger, if we're thinking about Ben Sisko in the middle there, are, you know, pursuing what they're interested in pursuing, challenging themselves, which is a theme that comes up quite often in Star Trek. This vision of humanity as, you know, a group that challenges itself collectively for the sake of that challenge, for the sake of both doing what you love to do and becoming better at it because that is a goal worth pursuing for its own end. That is something I love about Star Trek. Would I love to live in the universe when it's about kind of like coded racism and war? And no, I would not. But much like Harry Potter, I'm kind of selecting the part of the Star Trek universe I would like to live in. Spoiler, it's probably not Starfleet. Also, it's probably not a ship. Because those things explode much more than they probably should. But the Star Trek universe is obviously one of mine because, obviously.
And it's also worth noting that one of the appeals of the utopian post-capitalism is the fact that it's post-capitalism. Like, it's post the painful problem of getting out of capitalism, which is very interestingly dealt with in works like a lot of Kim Stanley Robinson novels or Cory Doctorow's Walkaway. Yeah. Like, these authors grapple with what that transition from capitalism to something else might look like and might feel like, which is great, but I wouldn't want to live in the world that's going through this convulsion of like trying to figure out what it means to get rid of capitalism. So we like Star Trek, we like these post-capitalist works because they skip over the hard part and they get to the good living.
Yep, totally.
So that's a point. Okay, so you have a couple more on your list?
I do.
Let's hit them up.
Yeah, so let's continue on that utopian train there. So let's go a little bit further.
You consider this utopian?
Well, right now I do. So let's go post
today.
Post capitalism and on to post scarcity entirely into a universe where benevolent AI can take care of everything you need. I'm talking, of course, about Ian M. Banks' Culture series, which is, for me, a really great complement to Star Trek because Culture covers a lot of what Star Trek either didn't do or didn't really think about in a really wordy, very deliciously British way. And I love Culture in particular because you can have those people who, like in Star Trek, are, kind of like go-getters who are challenging themselves for the sake of the challenge. But you also just have, like, very normal people who just want to spend all of their time being entertained or having fun or having sex or whatever their particular thing happens to be. And they can do that because they live in a post-scarcity society. They have benevolent AIs to take care of them. And that's cool. They basically can live their lives doing whatever the fuck they want within, reason. You're probably... Well, I won't go into spoilerific details about the extremes of that you'll find in some of the Culture books, but if you haven't picked up the Culture books and you're looking for that kind of like, what might people actually be like when they don't have any responsibilities and they can have all their needs met, the Culture does a really great job of exploring what happens.
Right, and Culture is a great read if you like either Kim Stanley Robinson's more utopian works, like 2312, or if you like Alistair Reynolds' Revelation Space books, but the more utopian of those books as well, so like The Prefect and Elysium Fire. Yeah. They meet in this like nice little messy zone, which includes maybe not benevolent, but functional and useful AI, as well as post-scarcity. Like, Kim Stanley Robinson has been writing works, what was, who wrote Accelerando that you're reading?
Charles Stross.
Yeah, so Charles Stross and Kim Stanley Robinson have this synergy when they talk about post-scarcity society, which is very, very interesting. Highly recommend that you read that whole cluster of works together to kind of get a sense for what Tony's talking about there. Yeah. But you have a couple other like weird-ass stuff on your list, so go for it.
Here's my transition between utopianism and empathy. Universes where empathy is really important. And that transition point is James Gurney's Dinotopia. If you did not grow up with Dinotopia, if you've never
you are missing out.
You can still discover it now. It's probably, your local library probably has a copy. If you want to buy a copy of Dinotopia or any of the subsequent books, I believe James Gurney has put out 4 of them now. They are beautiful.
I only have 2.
His art is phenomenal. The most recent one, obviously, like the first one was written, I want to say late 80s, early 90s, so some of the ideas about what dinosaurs look like are outdated, but the newest one came out in the last 5 years, I think, and it's very, very updated with these gorgeous illustrations of feathered dinosaurs. So check that out. But what I love about Dinotopia is, apart from it having dinosaurs, which obviously I'm into,
and being a topia,
right, and being a utopia, which
Dinutopia,
which actually, no, funny aside, one of the characters in the second book actually talks about that Dinotopia. If you go into the Greek, dino comes from a word that means terrible, and topia just means place. So Dinotopia actually translates as terrible place. Which is hilarious because it is not.
So
it
needs to be
place.
Dinutopia,
right? It needs to be something a little bit different. But basically, you have this whole society that has emerged as in the same way that the Federation in Star Trek and the Culture kind of have done, a great alliance between all these different intelligent races. It just happens to be on one island where there are dinosaurs as opposed to in space. But you have... which would be badass. So, James Gurney, next Dinotopia.
There's a comic. There's a comic for kids that is dinosaurs in space.
Excellent.
It's great. It's a science comic for kids.
But I would love to live on Dinotopia because it is beautiful and you can see it all through James Gurney's illustrations. There are dinosaurs and it is a utopia with dinosaurs. Moreover, it's not like another fucking Jurassic World with dinosaurs because,
And actually, the movie, or this miniseries, was actually not terrible. The miniseries is what introduced me to Dinotopia.
Oh my god, really? That's amazing. So,
it's amazing.
wow.
And I know people who really hate on it all the
Yeah.
time, but it was my introduction. I thought it was really weird and wonderful. And it got the utopic underpinnings really, really well. So it's not perfect, and it's kind of terrible, but it's also really, really great. Like, if you're a young person watching it for the first time, for context, I think Dinotopia came out relatively close on the heels of Walking with Dinosaurs, which at the time was really cutting edge CGI and things like that. So, I mean, there wasn't a lot of live action dinosaurs on television at the time.
Right.
So I actually own it.
Really?
It's on the same DVD as Journey to the Center of the Earth, not the good one.
Oh, yep. Yep.
So that tells you a lot about me and it. Okay, your last one.
Okay, so my last one, I
it.
said it was a connection to Dinotopia, and that connection is empathy. And it is, of course, Becky Chambers' Wayfarers series, starting with Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, then getting into A Closed and Common Orbit, and most recently Record of a Spaceborne Few, which I'm looking at on my desk right now, but I haven't opened it yet because I only got it in the mail today.
It's just raw potential.
But I will be reading it very soon, and I'm excited about that. But what I love about Becky Chambers, and I think what her work gets praised for a whole lot, is that she shows in every way possible how individuals, how societies, how species can respectfully live with one another and thrive in a kind of almost like future melting pot ideal where you have this cultural distinction, but at the same time vast respect for cultural distinctions. And what I love about that is that it isn't a utopia on par with, like, culture or even with Star Trek. Things are still shitty. Like, she does a good job of illustrating that, like, not everything is wonderful, and there are lots of problems. But within those problems, the individuals who she chooses to follow are the kind of people you would want to be friends with because they care for each other, they look out for each other, and they generally operate in societies where that is the norm rather than the exception.
Yeah, and it's I have not yet finished the first book, but I have been listening to the audio, which takes forever, in my defense. I would say that one of the defining features of the Becky Chambers trilogy, at least so far as I am aware, is the found family arc, which is really precious and can verge on the saccharine if it's overplayed. But in Becky Chambers' universe that she sets up, the found family is not overbearingly sweet. Like, it does grapple with real issues and real problems. Racism is a constant, or I guess speciesism in this case, is a constant challenge and battle that they have to overcome. Age is another thing that plays a pretty significant component in the first book. You have a really young character whose competence is questioned a lot.
Yes.
So on and so forth. So, and like neurodivergence, queer identity, that sort of a thing really plays in. So it's not that there's nothing else balancing it out, but found family narratives like Firefly, like all these other stories that we've grown up loving, they provide us with a home like that. There's a bit of the projection there. Like we want to find our own family.
Yes.
So we are drawn to texts in which characters have found family arcs.
Yes.
There's an element there, and it's totally legit, and that's fine. It's great,
Agreed.
Actually.
So that's my short list. But now that I've spent a good 15 minutes talking about that, I'm interested to hear more about what you have to say, because I grouped by work or franchise, and you grouped by some uniting characteristics. So I'm definitely going to have some input into these, but please tell me about your first characteristic. Like, what do you look for in a work that you would want to live in?
Well, actually, kind of right on the heels of talking about the found family arc being tempered by real-world concerns in Becky Chambers, one of the characteristics that draws me to a world, which makes it a world that I could possibly see myself inhabiting or like really would enjoy living in, is the acknowledgement that the world is complex, that there might be the mistreatment of various groups of people or species, but these worlds do not deliberately exploit them for plot.
Yes.
I do have some, like, insurmountable problems. Like, I might enjoy a work which features prostitutes in, like, old world prostitution. I might enjoy works that feature slaves. However, I could not possibly want to live in a universe, because I also don't want to live in my current universe, which has these things, you know? Like, I don't, those are two things that definitely push it over the line towards, nope, don't want to live there. Yeah. So I like a work that acknowledges that, like, people are shitty sometimes. And so a great couple of texts that do this, that have that acknowledgement but don't go over the line, that I mentioned, would include the Tensorate series by J.Y. Yang, and Book of Dust, and I guess, like, all of the His Dark Materials series by Philip Pullman, and the Binti series by Nnedi Okorafor.
Yeah.
These are worlds where, like, terrible things still happen.
Yeah.
But they're not exploiting that awfulness for titillation or, like, a major plot arc. So it's well-rounded, it's sensitive to, like, our current political climate, things like that, without, being exploitative. That's, like, the big flipping point for me.
Yeah, and
so those three texts are good examples.
That's great, and I would add to that that probably Octavia Butler's Parables books fall in that for me. Like, by the end of the second Parable book, and here's a spoiler, we see that shit's better, and we have...
See, I have to put my thumbs in my ears because I haven't read it yet.
Well, I'll just say that things majorly turn around at the end of the second Parable book, and if Octavia Butler had been able to finish a third one and it had been a trilogy, I would have been really interested to see, you know, the direction that had gone in. But it just ends on such, like, an optimistic note. I would love to be a part of, like, that part of the franchise.
So you'd be like, you'd want to live in a post-Parable of the Talents?
Yes, I would.
World. Okay, got it.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's legitimate. There are a lot of books, I did not include them on my list, where things happen at the end which do turn things around. And living in, like, Lord of the Rings after the fall of Mordor would be a whole lot easier than living in Lord of the Rings during, like, the Third Age of Man or whatever it's called. Yeah. So, yeah, no, I get that. That's totally legit. However, that did not make my list.
Yeah, fair. That is fair.
Yeah, just for reasons of space. Like, that probably would open up a whole new plethora of works.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But I do have some other characteristics.
Yeah, please.
Another characteristic that, and this has, of course, all of my texts have overlap. Like, there's elements of, or, like, aspects of these characteristics that show up in all of the works that I love. But worlds that I would want to live in have to be populated with smart characters that I'd like to meet. And also good characters who I'd want to be friends with. So, like, smart is not always the same as good.
Right.
I could not live, for example, in, like, a Sherlock Holmesian universe.
Right.
Because Sherlock Holmes is a jerk.
Yeah.
But a Sherlock Holmes plus Watson universe, that's the smart and the good. So that's kind of what I'm getting at. Like, I need smart characters, I need good characters. Often they are the same characters.
Yes.
And that's fine. A couple examples of texts where you have just characters who I'd love to have a beer with, or maybe not a beer, but, like, go roving through the woods with.
Yeah.
Would include Tess of the Road. That's a Rachel Hartman, or am I getting that wrong?
No, I think that's Rachel Hartman. I mean...
Okay, Rachel Hartman.
Yeah.
So good. That's a not quite sequel, but takes place in the same world as Serafina, which is also on my list. Lumberjanes, the comic series, just, like, absolutely wild and crazy. These characters are nuts, but they're so much fun to spend time with. Like, Lumberjanes is perhaps populated by the most accessible of all comic characters in my current repertoire. Like, I'm open to being introduced to even more accessible characters. That's fine. But right now, my favorite comic for character development and just, like, their interactions with each other is Lumberjanes. Yeah. They're all individually good characters, and together, like, they make a crew. That would be the kind of squad that I would want if I could go back in time and live in a slightly fantastical universe. Yeah. We also have on my list The Tea Master and the Detective by Elliot de Bodard. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation on that. Very, very much like the Sherlock and Watson dynamic happening there. You read this one, correct?
I did. Yes, I did. Indeed.
And so it's another like newish novella, and it grapples with this smart character, good character conversation in a really on the nose way, perhaps. Like it's definitely a part of the book that the smart character has to learn to be good, that the good character has to learn to be smart. And I find that a really interesting plot arc as well. But I would enjoy spending time with those characters. I also have That Inevitable Victorian Thing, which is a book that we read. I think we both read this last year. Yep. And it's so pure, and it's so great and so good by the end. Like, those three main characters, you just want to, like, wrap them up in quilts and give them a kitten and be like, okay, you're staying in my living room now, safe from the universe. And we're gonna have lots and lots of mugs of cocoa together and talk about queer things. So like I would love to live in, and this is perhaps the only truly historically inflected work that's on my list. It's definitely like a throwback universe with lots of Victorian nostalgia.
Yes.
Obviously.
Yeah.
And so that makes it a little bit of a standout for that. And I would also, last one for this characteristic, I would also love to spend time with the characters in Robin Sloane's Sourdough.
Yes.
And in their weird co-op basement science studio thing.
Yeah.
Their laboratory is just amazing. So it's a cool premise. It's great characters. But it's the great characters that bring that one home for me.
Yeah.
So
totally.
That would be my second characteristic.
Yeah, and I am totally with you. I would love to hang out with Tess from Tess of the Road. I would love to hang out with the protagonist of Sourdough, whose name I cannot recall right now. And as you're saying that, I'm thinking back to my list and how I would love to hang out with like Data and Tuvok and Hermione, and that would just be the best. And like absolutely there are other characters that I would put on that list. Like I would want to hang out with Agnieszka from Uprooted, from Naomi Novik's book Uprooted, and just so many. Like if we're talking about whether that is we are exporting them from their universe to ours, or whether we're joining them in their universe, like a good character, a character who you would actually want to be friends with, could go a long way towards making a particular universe bearable. I mean, these are all books and comics and works that we like, but having someone there who we so connect with is a plus, obviously.
It is a plus, and Sourdough's Lois Clary is kind of
right. The Lois Club. Oh my god,
the Loises.
Yes.
Yeah,
okay.
the archetype of like the accessible sort of Renaissance everyman character. So like that Lois is a great example of like a Watson like good character. Yeah. Like you just want to spend time with Lois because she's so good. She's so good.
Yeah.
Like there's so much that you could just unpack there in terms of we want to be around people who make it possible for us to be the best versions of ourselves.
Right.
And I feel like that could happen with me and Lois Clary.
Yes, but we are, and part of the reason why that can happen, and I think Lois is a really good example of that. Tess from Tess of the Road is another really good example of that. Like we get such privileged views into what these characters are thinking, what they're doing, what they're feeling, that we're really, we're in them so much that it's really, testament to a great writer that they can make these characters come alive. But really we're getting these privileged views into people that we would never have in the real world. And so it's, it's a lot easier, I think, to, when you see a character, or when you read a character you really connect with, to say, I would love to know that character, because then the writer has done their job, and really, given you a world that you would want to inhabit with this person who you've had as your doorman, kind of, you know what I mean? Yeah,
and I would make note that the worlds for all of these texts that I mentioned for this particular characteristic, the relatable characteristic, they don't have like super dark, traumatic, like crazy going to murder you worlds.
Right.
So like they're also worlds in which I could theoretically survive.
Right.
with a good friend or two.
Right,
you know?
right, exactly. And
it's not like the 5th season, which I love to bitch, but I would die in 2 minutes.
Right,
you know.
Right, exactly. Like, you're not, you know, even though they're characters maybe of a similar caliber, like, you don't want to be friends necessarily with, like, of Fred from The Handmaid's Tale or, like, Katniss from The Hunger Games. Like, you know, it's just,
because
it's
that
not
means
the
you're
same
living
thing.
in that dystopic, terrible place.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Which kind of is a nice segue to my third characteristic, which is not necessarily good or, you know, easy to survive, but intriguing worlds with, like, social experiments that I wouldn't mind, like, living in a little bit, but not necessarily with the characters that are in the book, if that makes sense.
Yes,
like, if I could take Alistair Reynolds' Revelation Space Universe, like, circa Elysium Fire, and hang out with, like, a barista in the glitter band, like, I would be there for that.
Yes. Yeah.
If I could inhabit Cory Doctorow's Walkaway, just, like, let's skip ahead about, like, 5 minutes so that, like, everyone's past all their angst.
Yep.
And then, like, again, basically in all of these worlds, if you introduced me to a gay barista, that would be the person I would want to live with in this world.
Fair.
Same goes for the 3-body problem. Great, phenomenal masterpiece, the 3-body problem. I don't necessarily want to hang out with the, like, super smart, inaccessible PhD physicists.
Yeah.
But a barista, when the world is, like, falling to pieces and you're being invaded by, like, suction flat and regenerating sponge people, like, that would be fascinating. Like, it'd be great. It'd be interesting, at least. As long as we didn't all die. Anything by Kim Stanley Robinson. Like, we've talked about how much we love his worlds, but his characters sometimes fall a little flat.
Yeah.
Again, introduce me to a barista on Luna after, you know, a couple of decades of settlement, or a gay barista on Mars, like, a little after everyone's done choking each other out.
Yeah.
And this kind of applies to Pamela Sargent and a lot of writers who are kind of getting going in the 70s and 80s, where, like, they had such rich ideas and they were more interested in creating a world of ideas at that point than they were in creating, like, accessible characters, which is fine.
Right.
That's totally all right and legitimate. It's just that I would want to go through that Mars. I would want to go, what is it, they go gliding in the Mars valleys? Like, I would want to do that with, like, other people.
Yeah.
And, like, Name of the Wind. I would not want to hang out with the main character in Patrick Rothfuss's Name of the Wind at all. He's kind of a jerk. But I would totally hang out in that universe where, like, the magical method is so fascinating. Like, we talked about magical systems.
Yes.
And the magical system and, like, the university environment is fascinating.
Yeah.
I would totally go to that college.
Yeah.
Just not with those people.
Right. Totally. Yeah. And I feel that so strongly. Name of the Wind, in particular, would definitely be on my list for this characteristic, as well as would most of Kim Stanley Robinson's works. I would add in a series that I don't think you're as familiar with, but Garth Nix's Old Kingdom series.
I've only read one, and it was,
But again, because, like, the
going.
magical system is so well thought out. What actually happens in the books makes it seem like that would be an absolute shit place to live. At least until the later books, and some of that is taken care of and the world isn't destroyed. Spoiler. But, like, you know, I would love to... It's right up there with the, you know, me wanting to own a wand because of Harry Potter. Like, I would love to own a set of 7 bells. Not necessarily to be a necromancer, but...
I feel like that's your next Halloween costume.
Oh
right
my
there.
god,
You'd be like,
that's such a good idea.
Everyone would be super confused, but you'd be having the time of your life with
great.
those bells.
Yes. And I would totally agree with you also on the 3-body problem, but only the 3-body problem, which I am sad to say will become very... Oh my gosh, just what... The other things that happen.
Don't spoil number 2. I'm gonna get to it eventually.
Oh, Lord. But yeah.
Oh lordy, I know what I'm in for now. So I did have one more characteristic, which is this is unrepentantly my aesthetic characteristic, where, like, I just want to surround myself with this pretty. Yeah. And that goes for, you know, very visual works, like a comic, like Arclight by Brandon Graham. Highly recommend. Absolutely stunning illustrations.
Beautiful. Yes.
Interesting world, too.
Yes.
A slightly confusing plot, but I'm okay with that. The world is slightly confusing to me. Yes. So, like, wouldn't be much of a change. So Arclight, gorgeous. Totally what I want out of, like, everyone's eyeliner for the next century. The Dream Quest of Valet Bow by Kish Johnson. We haven't talked about Kish Johnson on this podcast yet, which is a huge shame because I feel like taking Lovecraft, whose mind I would not want to inhabit in any universe, and reacting to him as Kish Johnson did in The Dream Quest of Valet Bow, which is very obviously like it's a reaction to a specific Lovecraft story. Somehow, Johnson has transmuted everything that is good about Lovecraft into a form that is, like, truly dreamy, in my opinion. Like, I could see myself surfing through those meadows and dales and looking up at that sky of folding things.
Yes.
It's very interesting. I could see myself in that world, enjoying it without being, like, overcome by how creepy and oppressive and gross it is. Because sometimes Lovecraft really gets into the gross. Which isn't to say that Johnson doesn't bring in the disturbing. There are disturbing elements to the Dream Quest of Valet Bow, but only in the way that, like, a really interesting dream is disturbing and not like a truly horrific one. So I would put the Dream Quest of Valet Bow on there just because the language, the way things are described, I would go through a colonoscopy in order to
wow.
that.
Okay. No. All right. That's how strongly you feel about it.
Write it up.
My God. Okay.
And closing out the comparison list there. So Arclight was a comic, Dream Quest of Valet Bow is a novella. The last book on my list for that particular characteristic, the unrepentantly my aesthetic characteristic, is Robert Jackson Bennett's Divine City series, which each book takes us to a new city, which is atmospherically weird in some way. And, like, I don't know about you, but one of the most amazing things for me to do is wander around an empty city at night. And I feel like I'm doing that every time I enter a Robert Jackson Bennett book. His latest Foundry Side just came out. It's similar. I would totally wander around these cities just late at night, early in the morning. There's something achingly beautiful about the way that those cities are constructed and described. So that would be my final characteristic right there.
That's I love that. I love all of the works that you mentioned there. I don't actually know that I have anything to add there. Probably if I did, it would be Dinotopia.
Dinotopia in like the book form. Totally. And that kind of, you know, we talked briefly about Above the Timberline, which is another book that came out that's kind of like coffee table size and full of these gorgeous illustrations. It came out last year, and it got very close to the top of our list as far as visual text goes. There's something about just like the sheer visual impact of these large scale books that are unafraid to give you art in addition to story. That's really, really deeply appealing. So I not only do I like the thingness of Dinotopia, but I also enjoy the story and the philosophy of it, which puts it kind of above. So totally. Yes, it's got both the aesthetic and the world.
Yes.
But before we close out the podcast, we have a couple minutes to burn, and I thought we should mention a couple, just like very briefly, like worlds that like we enjoy reading about, but we would not want to visit.
Absolutely right, and these are the books that you've heard us talk about if you've listened to really any episodes of the podcast before, but we definitely would not want to be on our let's live there lists.
Anything with giant spiders is out for me. So like Children of Time and The Spaceman of Bohemia, they're amazing books. I would totally want to meet Portia from Children of Time, but on the other side, very thick glass.
Exactly. Right.
Very thick glass. Like, I think you'd be fascinating, but also can we put you on the other end of like like the wrong end of a telescope so you look a lot smaller.
Right. Or, like, I'd love to have, like, a Skype date with a Portia, but that's all.
Yeah, but even the fact that, like, this spider exists somewhere in the universe and is smart enough to Skype with me is terrifying.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
I can't. Nope.
No,
Yeah.
not even going there. Spaceman of Bohemia, giant spider plus giant emoji lips.
Yeah. Maybe
Yeah,
not.
I mean, brilliant, but no.
Plus, eats your Nutella.
Oh, yeah, nobody steals my Nutella, dude. That stuff is
Nope.
sacred.
Yeah, that's
I'm
right,
like-
it is.
I'm drooling trying to pronounce it. It came out sacred.
It did come out like that. I thought maybe it was intentional. And I was willing to go with it because I thought you might have been Cher for a moment.
Sure. We've also mentioned on the podcast already, like the 5th season, I would die instantly, but if I could be in a nice, like, protective Kevlar bubble, I would totally love to just, like, there's a couple worlds that I'd like to be a fly on the wall, but would not want to live. And, like, a fly on the wall that can survive 5 minutes is ideal. And that includes also the Area X series. Like,
oh my god, would love reading more about it, would absolutely not want to be in it.
Same goes for The Stars Are Legion by Cameron Hurley. It's just, like, way too much sticky stuff. I work with kids. I could not handle a world made of goo.
Made of sticky things.
I would just die immediately.
Yes, and speaking of unknown goos, I would add The Expanse to that because I love it. Would love to be able to like be at that place, kind of like the work of Kim Stanley Robinson, where like most of the solar system is inhabited. Like you can totally go to Mars or the Belt. I mean, there are political implications, and you might not be able to, but like
you might be shot on sight.
There,
but
and I would love that. But I admire that universe from afar. I wouldn't really want to live in it.
Yeah, and we mentioned The Handmaid's Tale for obvious reasons. We would not want to live in that world.
Right.
And actually a lot of Le Guin worlds, just like a lot of worlds where the social experiment by default places people in conflict with other people. Like it wouldn't be a pretty thing to try and survive there. It would be uncomfortable and hard. And like I respect them. I love the shit out of Le Guin books. Highly recommend going back and listening to our memorial podcast for Le Guin, but wouldn't want to live there. And interestingly, the article that we mentioned at the top of the podcast helped sway this a little bit for me. The Forever War and like Starship Troopers and that whole Vietnam era, like warfare sci-fi. I wouldn't want to live in the midst of like a constant ongoing war. Where also where also homosexuality is enforced as a means of population control and it's not truly desired. Like it's kind of a thing that people are brainwashed into somehow. That is deeply uncomfortable. Like I would not. That's. We've talked about how like Xenogenesis by Octavia Butler creeps me the fuck out because it forces people to feel desire. And like I, as someone who is asexual and aromantic, like I do not have desire, and it's a fundamental violation of who I am to like force me to feel desire for something. So like, please, no, let's just skip over that.
Yeah, fair. And then you also said on this part of the list, basically anything YA.
Yeah.
And obviously we had a couple of exceptions to this.
The inevitable Victorian thing also,
Right. I would give an honorable mention to Anna Day's recent YA novel, The Fandom. Not because I would necessarily want to live in that world, but because this kind of question, what happens to people who like a world when they are suddenly a part of it? Like, how do they exist actually within that world that they like so much?
So meta for this podcast.
Right, it's so meta for this podcast, but if that question intrigues you, I highly recommend Anna Day's The Fandom.
Yeah, and I'm definitely going to check it out. It's not in our library system up here, so it's been a slow discovery for me, but I'll get there eventually. I feel like it's necessary for me to backtrack and explain why I wouldn't want to inhabit almost any YA world, because we just kind of like said it and then skipped. I don't mean to insult YA here. I freaking love YA. It's just that the common mode for YA is either realistic fiction, which is not science fiction, or like this dystopic science fiction thing. And there's two things that happen there. Right now, YA is still predominantly like very hetero. So like usually you have a romance, often it's a love triangle. I almost said a three-way, which is not the same thing.
Which would be awesome.
Let's do that.
Yes.
But like they're still fairly conservative in a lot of ways, because if you include queer content, often that bumps your rating up, which then makes you not YA as far as publishers and libraries go. So YA as a category tends to be very quiet about its queerness unless it's dealing with like contemporary YA, realistic YA, like Simon, the Homo sapiens agenda, things like that. So there's nothing for me in terms of that in a YA universe. Like it would just feel very straight and very just like I couldn't have room to be queer in a lot of these worlds. And then the second thing is that a lot of them are dystopic right now, and so that by default means that it would be really kind of terrible to live in those worlds.
Right.
So it's not that I dislike YA. I love to read it. It's just not where I would want to live.
Yeah. Fair.
That's just my little explanation there. And actually, like, I also would not want to live in anything that's really intended as social commentary, which a lot of YA is. So, like, I wouldn't want to live in Animal Farm. I wouldn't want to live in...
Oh, God, no. Oh, my God, no.
1984.
Whoa.
Those are extreme examples, but, like, anything that's, like... Oh, like, Vox is a recent good example. I wouldn't want to live in any world that's primarily designed as speculative fiction that's also social commentary. So, like, that's just, like, they're pushing things, they're exaggerating things for a reason. I respect it. I like to read it. Wouldn't want to live there. That's all. Yeah.
So I think our list of where we wouldn't want to, worlds we wouldn't want to inhabit is much longer in theory than our worlds we would, but which makes sense.
Well, and a lot of them we still enjoy reading.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not like we're dissing on these books. They're great books.
No. Right.
It's just if I had an atlas of the speculative fiction universe, I would plot my road trip to avoid them.
Totally. It's kind of like going house shopping in science fiction and fantasy. Like, we're looking at the Zillow of, I don't know, we're looking for certain criteria. Yours would be, intriguing worlds, characters you could get to know, worlds that acknowledge mistreatment, but, aren't themselves solely mistreatment that are your aesthetic. Like, I'm totally trying to smush all these together, but, like, that's the house you're looking for,
And no currently erupting volcanoes in the vicinity, please.
One would hope not.
Or giant spiders. A giant spider-infested volcano, which is very, like, heterosexual, is my nightmare.
Oh my God. So when you're doing your search, uncheck the box that says, looking for giant spiders.
Yes, please. That is not a thing I want to see on my Zillow.
No, indeed.
Okay.
No, indeed.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of our podcast today, Tony.
Yes.
So thank you for taking that wild ride across the country with me as we went in search of insanity.
Yep.
I thought you were going to say something there, and then you just went, yep. Okay.
No,
okay. But Tony, as delightful as it has been to spend this time with you on Skype, how might our listeners spend time with us online?
Well, buy us a drink first, and we'll see where things go. So you can check us out on our website. Always, you're going to find us at imaginaries.net. We have all of our reviews, all of our back episodes listed there. We're going to very shortly, in fact, by the time this podcast comes out, it will probably already be there, but we will have a place for the imaginary videos, which are going up on YouTube. So check those out.
Highly recommend watching them. Tony is a genius.
Thank you. Oh, that's obviously
blush away.
I appreciate it. If you're looking for more of our episodes, you can download them on iTunes, SoundCloud, or whatever podcast app you use. I have actually been finding out more and more that if you search for the Imaginaries on whatever podcast app you use, you can find us.
Yeah.
So cool. Check that out.
We're there.
And then, of course, all of our back episodes are up on YouTube in addition to the imaginary videos. And you can get in touch with us directly, either on Twitter, our handle is imaginary_pod, or by emailing us, that is imaginarypod@gmail.com with no underscore.
No underscore.
So we look forward to hearing from you.
We do, and not just because you're outraged that I don't want to live in your favorite world, Although we would love to hear that as well, because I'm sure that there's so many worlds that we skipped over in this podcast.
I'm sure.
Just because we are finite human beings, and science fiction is, by definition, far bigger than we could ever understand. So, have at it. Tear us to pieces, and also send us your recommendations. We have an exciting lineup of future podcasts.
We do.
That we are bringing down the pike. So you can look forward to some meows in our next podcast. I'm going to leave that open to interpretation. And on that note, bye!
Bye!